Most people dismiss Bigfoot as a campfire legend, yet when the forest falls silent and something unseen exhales beyond the tree line, doubt fades fast. Eyewitnesses speak of a towering presence, feral, calculated, and disturbingly strong, while officials blame bears or accidents. From a Wyoming RV park rocked by a midnight rampage to a Montana hunter who stumbles on a fog-shrouded beast feeding on its kill, in this video, we'll reveal 6 bone-chilling encounters with something far beyond the ordinary. The Bighorn Mountains stretched 200 miles across northern Wyoming, a rugged range that had everything from high meadows to jagged cliffs and even dense lodgepole forests. On paper, this was a camper's dream, away from all the complications of city life, and a perfect chance to reconnect with nature. On the western side, tucked by a service road, was a small RV park with a smattering of picnic tables and a caretaker's cabin. It wasn't the type of place tourists went to. You had to know it was there. On the night of September 7th, 2025, the park almost seemed deserted after the long Labor Day weekend. Most of the families had already left, but for the Montana couple, John and Sarah Harris, this was a godsend. They'd come for peace and the early fall air, parking their RV under the shadow of tall pines. Sarah was a middle school teacher while John worked in construction. They'd been waiting for things to settle down, and this was the start of their real vacation, alongside only a few other campers at their site. But peace was not in their fate. By 10 o'clock, the camp had gone quiet. Lanterns were turned off, and the smell of charred hot dogs and wood smoke was suspended in the air. Even nature went silent, with only the faint sound of wind whistling through the leaves and creek water slipping over stones coming through, acting as the perfect backdrop for a peaceful night's rest. But then, at about 2 a.m., the silence ended. John was the first to wake up. It sounded like something pounding in the distance, almost like a thunderstorm. He thought it was a dream, but as the sound grew closer and heavier, it seemed as if the ground itself was shaking from the shock of each impact. And then the RV shifted, rattling the dishes and moving the furniture. Sarah jolted from her deep slumber, still trying to make sense of what was happening. And the next thing she knew, she was tumbling from her bed. "What the hell?" shouted John, bracing himself against the wall. The entire RV was rocking from side to side, the stabilizers creaking like they were about to break, and with the high metallic shriek of the tearing hinges, it felt like doomsday. Sarah scrambled up to her feet, still shaken by her fall, and peered through the narrow blinds, and what she saw would remain imprinted in her mind for the rest of her life. It was upright, broad-shouldered, and taller than any human she'd seen before. The outline was covered in dark fur that caught the light as it zipped across. A couple seconds later, it slammed into an RV parked 2 slots over. The impact was so loud, it echoed through the woods like a car crash. Doors buckled, and a folding chair clattered against the rock. From the inside emerged panicked, high-pitched screams, just as the Harrises were starting to make sense of this new world they'd been plunged into. The next impact happened. It felt as though a giant had decided to shake the RV apart by hand. The Harrises froze. John's first thought was that it was a big bear, but bears didn't stand that tall, nor did they move with that deliberate, terrifying precision. Outside, a retired couple shouted for help, their voices cracking with fear. The creature circled, its heavy steps grinding the gravel underneath. With each step, the ground seemed to shake. Then came another blow, this time near the back corner of John and Sarah's RV, sending a tremor through the floor. Sarah gripped her husband's arm and whispered his name, but he couldn't answer. He was petrified, staring at the outline and watching it pivot slowly. Then it roared, not like a bear, not like any animal John had ever heard. It was deep and loud enough to rattle the air inside the RV. Windows shook in their frames, and somewhere in the distance, glass shattered. This thing was like nothing they had ever known. It was the kind of presence people whisper about in horror stories. But no matter how many times the Harrises tried to pinch themselves, they couldn't wake up. No, this was real, and it was happening to them. The commotion outside was unlike anything they'd seen. Half-dressed campers bolted with their flashlights, desperately trying to reach the caretaker's cabin. Another couple from Colorado abandoned their wrecked RV, stumbling into the tree line in the opposite direction. Panic swallowed the sight. The Harrises, however, stayed put. John locked the door out of sheer reflex, though the thought was absurd. After all, the thing outside had just torn steel like cardboard. The pounding lasted several minutes. It rammed one RV, then another. A door flew across the lot. Propane tanks toppled. Every sound echoed like a war drum against the serenity of the mountains. And then, the next thing they knew, it stopped. John sat in silence, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder, still reeling from the nightmare she just lived through. They waited for another slam, another roar, but all that came was the wind whispering in the trees. When dawn broke, the campground looked like a battlefield. One RV was on its side, its windows shattered. Another had its frame twisted, doors gone, interior destroyed. Coolers were scattered in the creek, chairs lodged high up in the branches, and in the dirt, pressed deep into the gravel, were footprints. Huge, unmistakably human in shape, except that each one was nearly twice the size of John's boot. They were imprinted on the site in deliberate arc, carving a path into the trees toward the ridgeline. But this is where things got even stranger. No food was touched, no trash bags torn open. In fact, not a single cooler was pried open for meat. Whatever had come through wasn't hungry. It was angry. When the sheriff's office arrived, they surveyed the wreckage with grim faces. By afternoon, the official report chalked it down as a bear attack, a big one, strong enough to flip the RVS. The campers exchanged looks but said nothing. But deep down, even the rangers knew a bear could rip hinges off doors without using claws. They knew this thing wasn't from this world, but they also couldn't afford to let people panic about the situation. As for John and Sarah, they drove home the following morning. They didn't argue when the deputy scribbled bear activity on the report, but in the weeks that followed, John found himself waking up at 2 a.m. to phantom thuds, the memory of the RV being rocked by an unknown force. Sarah kept her distance from the woods behind their house. Life moved on, but among those who'd been there, those who'd heard the roar and seen the size of the prints, one truth gnawed at them. Those woods had always held secrets, but that fateful night, one of those secrets stepped out of the trees and reminded everyone just how small they were. The Rocky Mountains of Alberta sprawled across hundreds of miles, their ridgelines cutting the sky like jagged knives. Peaks rose above 10,000 feet, glaciers spilled into valleys, and winter storms often arrived without warning. In these ranges, the silence was deceptive. It felt endless, yet could be replaced by the screaming wind in an instant. In January 2024, when the sun dipped behind the peaks before most people had even had dinner, the mountains turned into another world. Trails vanished, landmarks dissolved, and the wilderness closed in. For those who ventured there, preparation meant survival. Madeline Carter had spent over a decade skiing remote lines that most skiers would never even lay eyes on. At 33, she was experienced, disciplined, and used to being a lone wolf. That afternoon, she set out from a small cabin lodge with the plan of cutting across an unmarked ridge before nightfall. She had all the essentials in her pack: avalanche beacon, probe, first aid kit, 2 flares, and enough food to last a day if she got stuck. The ridge was narrow, bordered on both sides by steep drops into dense tree lines. The snow was firm, and her boots gripped the surface without trouble. But the clouds thickened faster than she expected, and by the time she reached the summit, the horizon had already dissolved. Snow began falling sideways, and in minutes, it turned into a blizzard. Sharp flakes hammered her goggles, taking her depth perception. She adjusted her hood, tried to steady her breathing, and angled her skis into a cautious descent. Each turn was deliberate, even though she was moving without any vision. The wind whistled so loud that it drowned out her own heartbeat. She paused often, straining to see more than 10 feet ahead. The storm had turned the ridge into a narrow hallway of white snow. But that was the least of her worries, because moments later, she noticed the tracks. They were half buried in the snow, yet still distinct. There was something off about them, though, and it wasn't down to the adversity of the trail. No, these prints were enormous, spaced in a stride longer than any human could manage, and each depression pressed deep, as though made by a weight several times her own. Madeline crouched down, brushed the snow aside, and revealed the rounded outline of a foot that didn't look like boot tread. For a moment, she stood still, trying to reason through it. No bear would be this high in midwinter, and no hiker would be crazy enough to climb during the storm. The tracks were too fresh to belong to something long gone, and the wind should have erased them already. But she had no choice but to press on, although now she was more alert. Each tiny movement in the trees below made her gut tighten. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and when she focused, the shapes would disappear. Then it came. The sound reached her first, a snap like a breaking plank, but much louder. Branches cracked in sequence, almost as if something enormous was forcing its way uphill. She swung her headlamp beam down the slope, but only saw the blizzard. Then the trees exploded outward. A figure surged through the snow, taller than a man, and shoulders as wide as a doorframe. Snow flew like a tsunami as it rushed forward. Madeline's body reacted before her mind as she pivoted and drove her skis into the slope, aiming away from the tree line. She managed 2 turns before a massive force struck her skis from behind. It was so strong that it hurled her sideways, and the landing wasn't better either. The impact took the air out of her lungs, and the fall made her lose her vision for a second. She rolled, scrambling for any firm surface, but all she saw was the creature. It stood yards away, half hidden by snow but unmistakably towering, and breathing heavily enough to send visible plumes into the storm. Madeline was ready for the worst, but it did not charge again. Instead, it paced slowly, circling her like a predator. Her heart was beating so loud, she thought the creature could hear it. She reached into her pack for anything she could throw at this creature, and her fingers brushed the hard plastic of her flare gun. Pulling it free, she snapped the cap and raised it skyward. The flare shot up into the sky, piercing its way through the storm, and for a split second, the snow glowed red as if it was covered in blood. The creature recoiled, its head turning sharply, but the sight under the red light was nightmarish. It was over 10 feet tall with fur matted by ice. Madeline did not wait. She mustered up the strength to stand up, one ski barely holding, and launched herself downhill. Her turns were clumsy, but adrenaline pushed her through. Behind her, the storm swallowed everything. She did not dare look back. She slid between boulders, arms flailing for balance, and the cold wind hit her face like needles. The sense of being followed never left, and she wasn't going to stop, no matter how dangerous the descent got. Seconds turned into minutes, and trees rose again, signaling the bottom of the valley. Through the blur, she finally caught sight of faint lamplight. It was the lodge. She stumbled into the clearing and collapsed. Staff on the porch shouted as she staggered to the doorway. The words coming out of her mouth made no sense. She was barely coherent, but her eyes told the story. They were fixated on the tree line as though the creature might emerge at any second. By dawn, the storm had thinned to light snowfall. Madeline went to the edge of the woods with 2 staff members, but all signs of pursuit were gone. The ridge looked untouched, except for some deep impressions where the snow hadn't drifted over yet. Prints far too large to belong to any person, spaced too wide to be a coincidence. But no trail led away from that. For days, Madeline replayed the moment in her mind. It was not a bear. Its movements were too deliberate. The thing she remembered the most vividly was the eyes. intelligent and piercing, as though they were figuring out whether she was worth taking. By the time she boarded the bus back to Calgary, the storm had passed. Tourists filled the lodges again, snapping pictures of snow-covered peaks. None of them would know what the storm had carried down from the ridgeline. Madeline carried the knowledge in silence. The blizzard had buried the tracks, but it hadn't buried the truth. Somewhere in the folds of those mountains, a predator moved, faster and stronger than any human, waiting for another storm to cover its approach. And each winter, when the wind hit her apartment windows, she remembered the circling footsteps in the snow and how close she'd come to being erased just like them. Northern Maine held some of the thickest forests in the country. The land stretched for millions of acres. Endless pine and fir rose in proximity, so much so that daylight struggled to reach the ground. Old hunting trails ran like veins through the woods, and things got a bit too dark for most people's liking during winter. Gideon Hawk and his younger brother Malcolm were ready for the hunting season, though. Gideon was 42, a bulky guy with gray streaks in his beard. He'd worked as a logger for the majority of his life, but he carried himself with patience and composure. Malcolm, or Mal, as everyone called him, was 38, and unlike his brother, he was often impulsive. They'd been hunting together since they were boys. Deer, moose, even bears. Nothing fazed them anymore, and they trusted each other in the woods the way only brothers could. On the afternoon of November 15th, 2024, the air was cold. Frost clung to the branches, and the ground crunched under every footstep. The men moved slowly, rifles hanging on their backs, and eyes scanning for tracks. Gideon was in the lead, watching the ground as much as the trees. Mal kept a few paces behind. They found the first print just past a low ridge. At first, Gideon thought it was from a moose. The print was clear and the edges were clean. However, when he crouched to look closer, he realized it wasn't a hoof. It was a footprint wider than Gideon's hand and longer than his boot. The toes were visible in the freshly pressed soil. However, things got even grimmer as he moved forward because each print was spaced far apart, almost as if the creature that made them had a stride twice the length of a man's. Mal was convinced this wasn't human, while Gideon didn't say anything. He just stood there, scanning the trees. The forest was still, perhaps too still. He motioned Mal to keep moving forward, even though fear had been instilled deep within him. They followed these prints for almost a mile. Sometimes they'd disappear, only to appear again on softer soil. The light was bleeding away, and shadows grew thick amongst the pines. But that's when they heard it, a low growl, echoing around the woods. It wasn't the short bark of a coyote or the call of a bear. It sounded like it had weight to it, like it came from something larger than life. Mal grabbed his rifle before Gideon could stop him. The shot cracked through the trees and echoed across the ridge. Birds flew from the branches, shrieking into the sky, and the entire forest felt like it had been shaken. Gideon thought the ground itself had jumped, but then he saw it, a silhouette moving between the trunks. It was massive, covered in dark fur, too quick to see clearly, yet tall enough to block out the few rays of light still shining through. Gideon's stomach dropped as the creature disappeared right in front of his eyes. They waited, with their hearts thumping and rifles raised, but the woods had gone silent again. Branches snapped in the distance, and they seemed to be getting closer. Then, a heavy thud, as if something had slammed into a trunk and obliterated it. The noise felt like it was coming from every direction at once. This thing was circling them. Gideon turned, trying to track it, but each sound was gone before he even got the chance to aim. This was his signal to get out of there. His voice was steady, but his palms were slick with sweat. Mal agreed with his jaw tight, and they backed out slowly, following their compass until they reached the trail where their truck was parked. Night had fallen by the time they set camp a few hundred yards from the truck. Neither of them said much as they pitched the tent. The growls, the prints, the dark silhouette, the events were running through their minds. They didn't start a fire because Gideon wanted to keep the camp dark. They ate cold rations in silence, then crawled into their sleeping bags. Every time the wind made the leaves rustle, it made Gideon's heart jump. He kept his rifle within reach, his finger brushing the trigger guard even as he drifted into slumber. At some point in the night, Gideon woke. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard a sound that froze his spine. It was a scream, Mal's scream. Gideon lunged for the flap as the tent shook violently, but by the time he ripped it open, he only saw chaos. Mal was gone, dragged across the forest in a blur. His sleeping bag lay torn half inside the tent. Gideon stumbled outside, barefoot, rifle in hand. His eyes darted all over the place, searching for any sign of his brother. The moon was bright enough to make the ground visible, and what he saw terrified him to his core. The dirt was torn up, dragged in a wide path that led straight into the trees. At the edge of the clearing were footprints, just like the ones they'd seen before. Gideon shouted his brother's name, but the forest answered with silence. Not even the wind whistled anymore. He staggered forward, following the path with his rifle aimed ahead, and as he went deeper, the shadows grew bigger. He heard a faint rustle ahead, then nothing. Each step sank into footprints far bigger than his own, and then, all of a sudden, the trail ended. The disturbed leaves stopped, and the footprints disappeared. Gideon ran around in circles, desperate to find his brother, but the forest had already closed in around him. Mal was gone, almost as if the night had swallowed him whole. Gideon fell to his knees, staring at the last footprint pressed into the dirt. Its size told him everything he needed to know. Whatever lived here was no man or bear. It was something else. He waited there until the first ray of light pierced through the leaves, but Mal never returned. By morning, he dragged himself to the truck. His hands trembled so badly that he struggled to start the engine. He left everything behind: the tent, Mal's gear, the torn sleeping bag, everything. The only thing he carried was his rifle and the memory of the scream that still rang in his ears. To anyone else, he could only say his brother vanished during a hunt. But Gideon knew the truth. The forest was not empty. Something was out there, something that stalked, waited, and struck with strength that no man could match. The Grand Woods National Park in northern Washington stretched across 60,000 acres of dense forest and mesmerizing scenery. The trees stood close, forming a wall of green and black shadows. Hidden among them, over 50 miles away from the nearest town, was a logging camp. It wasn't anything special, just a cluster of cabins, a workshop, and a dining hall where the men ate their meals after a day of heavy work. On the night of September 18th, 2025, the camp was quiet. Dinner had been served an hour earlier, and most of the men were still sitting at the long tables, talking in low voices or playing cards. Outside, the air was cold, and a soft breeze rattled the loose shutters on the cabins. Ethan Rourke, a logger in his early 40s, sat near the wall of the dining hall. He'd worked in camps most of his life, but this one felt different. It was too far from town and too deep in the woods. He tried to brush off the thought as he shuffled a deck of cards, but it was easier said than done. Out of nowhere, the lights above them flickered once, the generator straining. Several men mumbled under their breath, but then the room went black. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the wind outside. Someone moved a chair, another cleared his throat, but then came a sound that froze every man in the hall. A heavy thud, muffled, yet deep enough to make the floorboards vibrate under their boots. The men looked at each other in the dark, but before anyone even had the chance to speak, the sound came again, and this time, it was closer. Someone cursed under his breath, and then a chair tipped over. Ethan stood up, trying to take a peek outside through the windows, but there was nothing, only the faint outline of the forest. The next sound, however, sent shivers down their spines. A crash so loud it drowned the wind. It sounded like a tree snapping in two. Then, before anyone could react, something slammed against the side of the hall. The walls creaked and dust rained down from the ceiling. Shouts rang through the room. Before order could return, however, the wall near the entrance shook and then burst inward. Wood shattered and splinters flew everywhere, and through the gap came a figure so massive it dwarfed the doorway. It was covered in thick, dark fur and moved with incredible speed. Its shoulders brushed the rafters, and tables went flying as if they weighed nothing. Some men ran for their lives while others dove beneath the overturned furniture. Ethan could barely breathe, especially after staring head-on at the creature. He couldn't make out its face in the dark, but he could see the red glow in its eyes. The creature slammed its arm into a table, flipping it over. Some people got pinned under the wreckage, while others screamed for help. Ethan leaned against the wall and reached for his rifle. His hands shook as he loaded a round, and while he did that, all he could see and hear was chaos around him. A guttural roar filled the hall, and it wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. He lifted the rifle and fired into the dark. The flash lit the room for a second, showing the outline of a giant figure. The bullet struck, but the creature didn't even flinch. It moved sideways, quickly circling the hall. Then Ethan heard another man scream on the other side after being thrown against the wall. The lights flickered once more, but didn't return. Only the faint red glow of the lantern gave shape to the destruction. Ethan fired again, the shot echoing through the hall. But once again, it was useless. The creature had gone from where he'd aimed, moving with intelligence. The commotion continued, cracking wood, shattering glass, the scrape of claws against the floor. Then, just like that, there was nothing but silence. The air was filled with dust and smoke from the rifle. The men froze in their places, waiting for the next attack. But the only sound that came was from the outside, branches breaking, trees bending, and then nothing but the night wind again. No one moved for a while. The hall was destroyed. Tables lay splintered, supplies scattered, windows cracked, and massive footprints pressed deep into the floor. Ethan finally lowered his rifle, and around him, men started crawling out of the wreckage. Most of them were injured, but they didn't speak. No one wanted to break the silence. In the morning, when light poured through the broken walls, the full scope of the damage lay bare. The hall looked like a tornado had just torn through it. The loggers stood together in the daylight, staring at the footprints. None of them matched anything they'd seen before. These prints were too wide and too long to be human or animal. Ethan said little. He stared at the trees and thought of the creature that had obliterated their camp. No bear could move like that. No animal should. By noon, the camp was abandoned. Trucks and equipment were left behind. The men gathered what little they could carry and drove out together, leaving the ruins of the dining hall behind them. Some said they couldn't forget the sound of the creature's roar, while others swore they'd seen the outline clearly enough to notice its fur and red, glowing eyes. Ethan, on the other hand, only had one thought. Whatever it was still out there, and the forest was no longer theirs to claim. Stretching for thousands of miles across Russia, the Siberian taiga was one of the largest forests in the world. In winter, the trees stood heavy with snow, and the rivers froze. Few dared to live inside this wilderness. Only small villages broke the vastness, and most of them clung close to the rivers for food and water. In early January 2025, the river was completely frozen, and the only creatures that roamed the area were elk, wolves, and sometimes bears that hadn't gone fully into hibernation. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and at night, the temperatures fell so low that wood in the cabins cracked as it froze. But none of that fazed Nikolai Petrov. He was a 43-year-old wildlife photographer and had appeared in Russian magazines, often showing rare birds or elk moving through the woods. He was patient and solitary, a man who preferred the quiet of the forest rather than the fast life of the city. He'd been planning this trip for weeks, telling friends he hoped to capture shots of lynx along one of the frozen streams. He traveled light with only his camera equipment, a tent, some food, and a small notebook for his observations. He set up camp near the edge of a stream, choosing a place where the trees were less dense. The The villagers last saw him on January 11th as he waved them goodbye and walked steadily into the woods. 3 days later, hunters moving through the area found his camp. The tent was empty. The fire had been out for a while, and its ashes were buried beneath a thin crust of frost. A small pot still sat on the stone ring where he'd left it, and his bag was half open with untouched food inside. At first, they thought he'd gone to scout further in the woods, but then they looked at the ground, and it told a different story. Footprints led away from the camp. They were clearly his, heading straight into the forest. They continued for nearly 100 meters before stopping abruptly. There was no return journey within these prints. No sign of him moving left or right either, just a sharp end, as if he'd vanished into thin air. Next to the last prints were several scattered items. His camera, with its lens cracked, and the lens cap was a few feet away. His notebook was also on the ground, although its pages seemed to have been covered in frost. The hunters carefully picked it up, finding the last lines written in hurried strokes. Something enormous, watching, moves like a shadow, glowing eyes in the fog, cannot run. It knows the forest better than I do. The men brought the notebook back to the village. When word spread, a search party was formed, and villagers, hunters, and a few men from nearby settlements set out, following the tracks again. They found more signs, large footprints in the snow, too big for any man. They were human-like in shape, though, which made this whole case even more of a head-scratcher. And these prints were entrenched so deep into the snow that the hunters said it must have weighed more than a bear. These prints followed Nikolai's for a short distance before turning toward a dense thicket of pines. The villagers tried to follow, but once they reached the trees, the prints vanished. No broken branches, no trail, nothing. Not that different from Nikolai's own footsteps. The search continued for days, yet they found nothing. No body, no belongings, not even torn clothing. When the men returned, the stories began. Around fires, hunters spoke in low voices about the strange prints. Some said they'd never seen anything like it. Others swore the ground felt unnaturally heavy, almost as if the forest itself had pressed down into the ground. Old women shook their heads and said the forest had taken him. At night, the whispers grew louder. Some said Nikolai had written the truth in his notebook, that something had been stalking his camp in the fog. Weeks passed, yet no sign of Nikolai was ever found. His tent and scattered belongings gathered by the hunters were brought back, though most of them feared that keeping those would attract the creature to the village. Everyone started avoiding the stream after dusk. Even hunters who'd spent their lives in the forest stuck close to the villages when the light began to fade. They spoke of distant songs, branches snapping when no animal was there, heavy steps muffled by snow, and sometimes the uneasy feeling of being watched. Seasons passed, but Nikolai Petrov was never seen again. Yet his notes and the strange tracks in the snow left behind a story that wouldn't die. The villagers spoke of something that walked like a man, but stood taller than any man could. Some called it a predator. Others whispered it was unlike anything known in these woods. Whatever anyone said, however, they all agreed upon one thing. Something lived within the forest, watching from the shadows, waiting in the fog, and it had taken Nikolai Petrov without leaving a trace. The Bitterroot Mountains rose across western Montana, a jagged line of peaks and valleys that stretched for hundreds of miles. Deep pine forests, steep cliffs, and hidden basins. The landscape had everything. During autumn, hunters filled the trailheads looking for elk and bear, but once the season ended, the mountains were left alone. After all, with the fog and snow rolling in, it wasn't a place for the careless. Storms rolled in without warning, and the landslides could swallow a man whole. On November 3rd, 2023, 41-year-old hunter Colton Pierce rocked up to these peaks. But that wasn't an issue for him. He was a lifelong hunter who'd grown up in Darby, a small town near the valley floor. He knew the mountains like the back of his hand, because he'd followed his father into the woods since boyhood. Hunting was both a tradition and a necessity for him, and each winter, he stocked his freezer with elk meat taken from the mountains. He wasn't reckless, though. He made sure to check the weather before heading out, but most importantly, he trusted his instinct and experience. That morning, he left his truck before dawn, a rifle hanging on his shoulder. The cold air stung his lungs as he climbed slowly into the foggy valley. He followed the game trails by instinct, watching the ground for prints, and an hour into his climb, he found them, the fresh tracks of an elk. They were clear and recent, perfectly outlined in the soft ground. He crouched down, running his hand over the edges, then got back up and followed. But something was off. The fog was thicker than it had ever been, and as he went higher, it only got worse. Colton knew he was wandering into dangerous and uncharted territory, but he'd come too far to turn his back now. He was so close to finding this elk, and he thought he could get it and return before the fog got worse. He soldiered on, but as he continued, trees turned into gray pillars, and their tops disappeared in the mist. Even the sound was strange. The frost crunched under his boots, but he moved with care, keeping his rifle ready. After 30 minutes, the trail led to a clearing. Expecting to see the elk, he stepped out from the trees, but what he saw left him petrified. Through the fog, about 30 yards ahead, a hulking shape hunched over on the ground. It was massive and had dark fur. Its broad back rose higher than any man, and its arms moved with steady force as it worked over something on the ground. Then the fog shifted, and the shape sharpened. It was a freshly killed elk, its ribs cracked open. The hunched creature tore pieces of flesh free from the elk's body with frightening ease, but it wasn't some feral animal ripping into its prey. No, every movement looked calculated, like it knew exactly where to cut. Colton quickly dropped behind a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding through his chest. His first thought was that he'd found a bear, but no bear moved like that. Even from the side, he could tell the creature was upright with long and heavy arms, almost humanoid in nature. Every part of him wanted to run, but his body refused to move. He gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles whitened. The sound of tearing flesh filled the clearing. He shifted his weight slightly to peek over the log, but the frozen branch under his boot snapped. The noise echoed through the fog like glass breaking. Colton knew he was in trouble. The creature stopped and slowly raised its head, and Colton saw its face clearly for the first time. A bulky, fur-covered face with glowing eyes that fixated on him through the fog. A low growl erupted from its chest, and it almost sounded like the earth itself was shaking. Every instinct within Colton screamed to fire, but he couldn't raise his rifle. He was pinned down by its stare. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature straightened and moved away from the elk with smooth steps, vanishing into the fog without a sound. Silence engulfed the clearing, except for Colton's ragged breathing. He waited, unable to move behind the log, and listened for movement, but nothing came. The fog closed around him again, hiding the trees and whatever had just walked into them. After a few minutes, Colton finally managed to stand up, his legs still shaking, and stepped closer to the elk carcass. The animal had been torn apart with terrifying strength. Its ribs were cracked cleanly, and flesh was stripped off by some unnatural force. He crouched near the blood-soaked earth and saw prints in the mud. These weren't hooves or paws. They looked human, except that they were at least twice as big as his, and pressed so deep the water had already pooled inside them. Colton stumbled back, then turned and ran as quickly as he could through the fog. He did not stop to rest, nor did he look over his shoulder. He couldn't afford to. He just ran until the mist thinned and the silhouette of his truck appeared at the trailhead. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving and sweat freezing on his face. He knew what he'd just seen. It was no bear, no man. Something else had claimed the clearing. When he drove back to town, he told no one. Only later, to his wife, did he speak of the creature's size and its movements. The Bitterroot Mountains remained as they always had, quiet and unforgiving. But for Colton Pierce, they no longer felt like home, because somewhere in that valley lurked something he could not explain, and he had seen it feeding